Welcome to the Red Sneakers Writers Podcast. News, interviews, and writing tips for people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them achieve it. Your host is the nationally best-selling author of more than 50 books, William Bernhardt.
Hello, Red Sneaker Writers. Welcome to the first ever live stream and video edition of the Red Streaker? No, that would be something entirely different. The Red Sneak. See, that's why you tune into the live stream, because you get to experience stuff like that. The Red Sneaker Writers Podcast. For the first time ever, we're doing this live and we're recording video at the same time. But don't despair. If you couldn't get into the live stream today, Jesse, who's in this stream right now, is going to edit it all and polish it and send that video version to my website, williambernhardt.com, and the YouTube page, where I also have a channel which you can subscribe to, and then you won't miss any of those. And if you're accustomed to listening to the audio version of the podcast, you can still do that. It'll be out on Sunday. You'll hear the audio version. It'll have show notes with lots of web links and the highlights of everything we have to talk about. With me here today is Jesse Ulrich, my producer and sound expert, engineer. I don't know. What do you prefer, Jesse?
Sound engineer sounds good. So that makes me feel good.
I'm acting like you're here for the first time, but of course you're not. You're always here. People just don't see or hear from you except from in the beginning. But you've been with. This is the 67th podcast in this series numerically. So you've heard a lot of writing advice. So has it inspired you? Have you picked up the pen? Have you started the Great American Novel yet?
I have not started the Great American Novel, but it has improved my writing in general, though. You just can't help sort of, get grabbing some of this information and be like, yeah, I need to be better at describing things.
Fantastic. And there's a book on that.
I know. I did its audiobook, so I learned a lot from that one.
That's right. Something description. What's the first word? Dazzling?
Yeah, the dazzling descriptions, yeah.
Dialogue, dazzling description. Fabulous book on description, just like you said. Anyway, Jesse is the brains behind this live stream and the video version, so thanks again for being a part of this. I really appreciate it. For this podcast, I wanted a super special guest to launch this video edition, so I reached out to the most special person I know, not only a fantastic writer, but also a fantastic teacher. Some of you already know I'm talking about David Morrell, who is the author of many, many books, including First Blood, which is a terrific novel on its own, but is also the book that became the first of the Rambo movies, which has now gone on to become one of the most successful film series of all time. He's also written The Brotherhood of the Rose, which became a television miniseries that launched right after the Super Bowl. Most recently, he's written a trilogy of books featuring the real-life person, Thomas DeQuincy. The first of those is called Murder as a Fine Art. He's also one of the co-founders of International Thriller Writers, one of the most successful, probably the most prosperous writer groups out there. And best of all, he is a fantastic writing teacher. So I'm going to be digging deep to get all of his secrets and tips that he can share with all you Red Sneaker writers. But first, the news. I didn't know if we'd have music cues or not. I am so impressed. Jesse, you score again.
I am a sound engineer, as we discussed. So,
for the news segment this time, I've got 4 stories for you. 2 about new opportunities for writers, because I know Red Sneaker writers are always looking for that. And 2 about new studies that have just been released that are really blowing the lid off what people have assumed in the past, what people thought were true about publishing and writing and marketing. And so I want to talk about those. First, the opportunities. Number 1, and this is pretty big news. HarperCollins, one of the big 5, about to be the big 4 New York publishers, has announced that they're going to launch a new fiction imprint. It's going to be called Harper Muse. It'll be coming out of their Nashville office, and it's going to publish women's fiction, which I know many of you are writing, historical fiction, Southern fiction, and here I'm quoting right from their release, stories that resonate with millennial and Generation X readers, which to me, all that means is people younger than I am. If you're targeting that audience, and particularly if you're writing women's or historical fiction, this might be another market for you, and we all need more markets. For those of you who are writing shorter pieces, short fiction, poetry, and I know there's a lot of that too. I get that all the time on the Red Sneaker Writers Facebook page. Submissions to Babylon Books are often asking about short fiction. Well, here's a new opportunity for you. Astra Publishing House, which is a very distinguished publishing house, is launching what they're going to call Astra Quarterly, led by Nadja Spiegelman, who I believe is who you see in the picture right now. She has been in the past the editor, the online editor of the Paris Review, one of the most prestigious literary journals out there. And they're going to be looking for poetry, short fiction, short nonfiction pieces. Again, a valuable addition to the markets available for all of you hardworking Red Sneaker writers. Now let me talk about the two reports. First, one from Findaway Voices, which of course concerns audiobooks. Two caveats right up front. First one, Findaway Voices is in the business of distributing audiobooks, so they're not exactly impartial on this subject. Doesn't mean this isn't accurate, it just means I'm giving you the straight skivvy. Second caveat, I work with Findaway Voices. I use them for the books that we distribute for our publishing house. But then again, I only use them because I trust them and think they do a really good job. The story it has to do with a report they've issued based upon research from the Audiobook Publishers Association, called the APA, which explain, if nothing else, why you should first of all be making audiobooks of your work whenever possible, and second, why you should probably be taking it wide instead of focusing on a single market, like, say, perhaps, I don't have to say the name, you know who the big market is out there. Number one, here, I'm going to give you 3 takeaways from this report, but that link that Jesse has put up on the screen, you can use. Go read the report for yourself. 1, audiobooks are continuing their skyrocketing rise, 16% growth in sales in the past year. Some people predicted audiobook sales would drop since during the lockdown people haven't been commuting as much. That is not what happened. So now this is 8 straight years of double-digit revenue growth for audiobooks. Second takeaway, for the 3rd year in a row, more than 50% of the people who listen to audiobooks are finding new time. In other words, they're making time to listen to audiobooks. Yeah, people are commuting less and they're driving less, but they're not listening to audiobooks less. They seem to be listening to them more. According to Chirp, which is sort of the book bub for audiobooks, 59% of their listeners listen to audiobooks while they're doing chores, like at home, housework, or exercising, or going on walks. And a good 15% are making time for audiobooks, which I totally believe. I've done the same thing. I sometimes listen to audiobooks or podcasts, but I'm not driving so much, so I've started listening to it in the morning, like when I feed the cat and water the plants before I sit down and write, or whatever. I've talked to people who have said, I used to read, like with my eyes, an actual book, like the ones back there, but now at bedtime, I listen to an audiobook, which they find a relaxing way to wind down at the end of the day. The house is now the place where people listen most often. And apparently, one of the biggest reasons for this is smart speakers. More than 60% of the people polled have smart speakers. I mean, like an Amazon Echo. I won't say it because then she'll answer. Or a Google Home or something like that. And 46% of those owners are using it to listen to audiobooks. So not only have they become more popular, the way people are listening to them is changing and helping them listen to audiobooks more. One last takeaway from this report, there is a clear market now for shorter audiobooks. Not everything has to be novel length. 43% of the audiobook purchasers who were polled said that they'd buy an audiobook that is 1 to 3 hours long. I'm telling you, some of you are here probably because you found one of those Red Sneaker books on audiobook at Audible or someplace like that. I never anticipated this, but I very much think the fact that they are relatively short, usually 2 to 3 hours, has made them more appealing, less expensive too. But I think that's helped the success of the books, which initially sold much better as audiobooks than they did in print. Do you have something like that? Something shorter, short stories, novellas, or something with a nonfiction basis that you could be turning into an audiobook? Think about that for a while, because this could be a real opportunity for you. One last article, and this is the big kahuna for this episode. This is what literally everybody, okay, maybe not literally, but a whole lot of people are talking about in the publishing right now. And this is a new report from an outfit called the Panorama Project. That is a cross-industry research institute that was started a couple years ago by Overdrive. As many of you will know, Overdrive is a distributor that is primarily sending digital material, ebooks and audiobooks, to libraries. So, based on the data they got from Busterford, my cat may be making an appearance at this point, which is okay, it's his house, we all know that. Anyway, the Panorama Project drew data from more than 4,300 respondents late last year, between September and November. And the report is upending a lot of what people thought about publishing. A lot of the standard beliefs, traditional cliches even, generally accepted so-called wisdom may not be true. And I've got 3 takeaways from that report for you here. But again, there's the link. You can read the whole report for yourself if you want. Number 1, and this has to do with avid book engagers. Note engagers, not saying purchasers, not saying readers, but people who engage with more than 4 books per month are considered by this survey active book engagers. The report shows that they are, quote, equivalently active in other media as well. And by other media, we mean film, television, video games, computer games, music. The traditional thinking is that books are in competition with all those things. That may not exactly be true. I know traditionally major publishers have been reluctant to advertise on television shows, even when at one point I was trying to get them to take out ads on Court TV. It seemed like the obvious choice for me. Nah, they said, people who watch TV just watch TV. They don't read books. Well, that appears to perhaps not be true. It looks like this is an opportunity for publishers, including self-publishers, including writers, to benefit from cross-media discovery. It may be time to stop thinking about other media as competition and realize that people who like getting stories from books also like getting stories from film and television and other forms of storytelling, other media. Okay, takeaway number 2. The report also finds that, you're going to love this, that book discovery is, quote, context agnostic and highly distributed. What? You don't know what that means? Immediately?
I do not.
Neither did I. You're not alone, Jesse. What they're trying to say is that we may not have the right perception about how people discover books. The traditional wisdom has always been that the number one way that people by far discover books is word of mouth. Now, that could be digital word of mouth, reading something like Goodreads. It could be at your workplace water cooler, people talking about a book they just read that they liked. Well, that is still a significant way that people discover books, but perhaps not as significant as people thought. According to a recent study, in fact, according to this study, only about a fifth, 20% of books are discovered that way. Now, to be fair, you need to combine categories. If you see the graph on methods of book discovery, they've separated out recommendations from friends from recommendations with family. Yeah, there it is. See the graphic? The bottom and the third from bottom are both, recommendations from family and friends. Those probably should have been combined. But even if they do, it's still only a relatively small portion of how people are discovering books. They're discovering books on social media. They're discovering them on book-related websites like Goodreads, bestseller lists, librarians, even, of course, Amazon, which could suggest that those Amazon ads some of you are paying for are even more valuable than you realized. So look at one more graph that came out of this report, and this has to do with the place of book discovery. The largest category, you see at the bottom of the chart, the very bottom, the largest category is browsing online bookstores. Just to be clear, not brick and mortar stores, but online bookstores. To be fair, we've been through a lockdown. A lot of bookstores have been closed, and if they're not, people have been reluctant to go. Nonetheless, this may change the way people think about book discovery. Over and over again, I've heard people say they still like to go to bookstores because they like to browse. It's fun. They discover new books. But here's the reality. Even the biggest Barnes & Noble superstore is only going to be able to cover 20,000, maybe 30,000 titles total, and most will carry far less, whereas an online bookstore may carry hundreds of thousands, even potentially millions of books. So as browsing goes, if that's what you're after, you can see why online bookstores are far more browsable than any online bookstore, than any brick and mortar store ever could be. Okay, third and final takeaway. The report, and this is the one that's really controversial that everybody's talking about, the report found strong, very strong book buying patterns among Black and Latinx millennials, saying, quote, men, millennials, and non-white people of all generations, end quote, are groups that publishers should be paying more attention to. Millennials are engaging with books more than baby boomers. Again, that's engaging, it's not buying, it's not even necessarily reading, but it's still startling. The traditional wisdom has been that primary book buyers are women 40 and over, and that, according to this report, is still true when you talk about people buying books to give as gifts, but is not necessarily true in the other categories. Well, this is important. This information may affect what you write, it may affect who you write it for, and it may affect your decisions about how to market it, which is why I've spent so much time with it. Just as in every other field, Red Sneaker writers, knowledge is the key to success. So here's your knowledge for today. Let's talk to our guest. My interview today is with David Morrell, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. He is one of the finest writers, best teachers, and to be blunt, nicest guys I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. He is, of course, Rambo's daddy, to quote a friend of mine, a character he created for First Blood and has then had some decent success. He is also written, well, there's The Brotherhood of the Rose, which became a television miniseries. First episode launched after the Super Bowl, if I recall correctly. And his most recent work is a trilogy featuring the real-life person Thomas de Quincey in a series of books that began, there's the first one, Murder as a Fine Art. He's a great writer, he's a great teacher, and thanks for being on the first ever video episode of this podcast. David, how you doing?
I'm all right. We're debuting here. This is exciting.
And it's working. The tech is working.
And the technology
That's the
is
most
working.
exciting part. Thanks
Amazing,
again to, thanks again to Jesse. Okay, I have a traditional first question, David, which I did not warn you about at all. So feel free to take a minute. But here's how I usually launch. If you could give an aspiring writer one piece of advice, and you could give 20, but if you had to pick one piece of advice to give them, what would it be?
I have one readily available, but I have to preface it by this little explanation. The person who taught me to write a science fiction writer named William Tenn, whose real name was Philip Klass. He pointed out to me that the people who go the distance, who have careers, are identifiable as one of a kind. Nobody wants to read an imitation Michael Connolly, for example. And so he said, you have to determine who you are as a writer and stick to it. So my advice always is be a first-rate version of yourself and not a second-rate version of another author.
I think that's terrific advice. So, when you decided what you were going to be, were you in the early days thinking, I want to be the best thriller writer out there? Or did that evolve over time?
Well, you're very kind. Someone asked Stephen King why he wrote horror. The answer was, and it's a sniffy question, it's dismissive, but his answer was, what makes you think I have a choice? And the same applies to me with thrillers, which have a wide range. My childhood wasn't the best. My father died in combat. My mother could not take care of me and earn a living at a time years ago when there were no social services. So she was very reluctantly forced to put me in an orphanage. So I was about a year, I say spent time in it, it's like prison, And later, when she reclaimed me, she had remarried, but the man she remarried didn't care for children. So there was a lot of fighting in the house. I'm not saying it was for that reason. But I still have vivid memories of when I was 4 and 5 and 6 years old, of hearing all these arguments and crawling under the bed. First, I put pillows under there as if I was asleep. I hadn't seen any bad prison movies, but
But it came instinctively.
Instinctively. So I was telling stories even then, and I crawled under the bed, and that's where I slept. And I slept before I went to bed. I told stories to myself. Now, as I also tell people, the two primary choices, lots of choices, but two primary choices are you can be a victim of a story, or you can be the hero of your life story. And I even then wanted to be the hero, and the stories I told, people weren't rescuing me, I was rescuing them.
Right.
So in a way, I had baked into me the kinds of stories. Right.
It makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about First Blood, which I'm going to guess you've done once or twice before in the past.
It's happened a couple of times.
Am I right in thinking that was your first published book?
It was my first published book, and it was my first book.
First one you wrote, even?
Yes.
Wow.
It was. Well, I spent 3 years on it, and I had a good teacher, the Philip Klass, William Tenn. He was a professor of writing at Penn State. At the university had done this amazing thing and hired a professional writer to teach writing. I mean, astonishing idea. And he was very generous. And it was a long process of how he taught me the attitude that he thought people should have toward writing. But when I got into it, it was a 3-year process, eons ago in the Stone Age, when you wrote with a chisel into rock, and starting in 1968. Yeah, well, actually before electric typewriters. But I started the book in 68 and I finished it in 71. But I was also in graduate school at the time, so I was writing my dissertation at the same time. So it was but I would say if you cut it all, it was a 3-year process.
Now, I've read First Blood more than once, in fact, and when I read it, I mean, and I'm not just saying this because you're here, this is a very literary novel. This is not The Executioner with, Mac Bolan or something. And this is not something I would ever think, wow, that's going to launch a huge macho action film series. This is a serious piece of work. How did that turn into the film series?
Well, we have to realize A critic once called me the mild-mannered professor with the bloody-minded vision.
Yeah.
And I am a professor as much as I'm a novelist. And I was writing in graduate school at Penn State. I was getting my master's and my doctorate, and it's very odd, I guess, for some people to think that I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the works of John Barth, and that John Barth devotee wrote First Blood. I mean, at first this seems incongruous unless you read the book, and then you can see the traditions that it comes out of. And it's very, in its way, scholarly. I used Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces as my template and as my structure. He says all stories of a 3-act structure: separation, initiation, and return, which is so that it's in the town, it's up in the mountain, and when he comes back to the town, he's a different person. And the other thing is that my master's thesis is on Hemingway's style. I quite like Hemingway. Again, be a first-rate version of yourself. But what I learned from Hemingway was that it occurred to me that if you look at him in a certain way, he's an action novelist. For Whom the Bell Tolls, or before that, A Farewell to Arms, or he wrote a gangster novel, To Have and Have Not. Brilliant action scenes, and in them, as he said, he always tried to do in other contexts, to write something as if it hadn't been written about before. So as I started First Blood, the goal was to try to find a new way to write action. And it wasn't in a way that hard, because, a shot rang out. If a writer wants to upset me, they put a shot rang out in their book. Because a shot does not ring out.
It's not a bell.
Bells ring. And beyond that, it's so tired, and where the hell did this come from? So I was looking for ways to write that sort of thing, but to write them, if you like, with the integrity and the authenticity that Hemingway did, though I wasn't imitating him. So that was the model. And it worked, because
Still works.
Here we are 49 years later, the book's never been out of print. And kind people like you mentioned that the style and aspects of the story had an impact, and it makes those 3 years, boy, they were frustrating 3 years. I had no idea I would be able to finish, but I just knew I wanted to write that story.
See, the Hemingway influence, I've read Barth too, but Hemingway, the sparse yet effective, every word is the right word, that approach to language, that's what I see all over First Blood, and subsequent novels too, but especially
and this is where Hemingway and Barth come together. I was trying to understand how Hemingway could be so vivid. I mean, when you read Hemingway, it's just it's right there in front of you. And John Barth actually unlocked the secret. He wasn't talking about Hemingway, but he was talking about one-dimensional versus three-dimensional fiction. And he said that basically one-dimensional fiction is that fiction which relies only on the sense of sight. It is by definition flat. And to the degree that you add other senses, and he recommended minimizing sight and adding 2 other senses in a technique. And that is basically what I've done all my career. And you won't always see me doing it, because it's not obvious, but I embed them, and they are on the page. And I've said this to other writers, the beginning writers especially, and they come back with a scene and say, see, I took your advice, and it's all sight. And I say, well, where is this and this and this? And they said, well, it's right there. And I said, no, it's in your head. You haven't communicated it on the page.
Jesse and I were actually talking about description before you came in, and and if I remember what I read in your book on writing, when you're talking about triangulation, you're talking about using more than one of the senses rather than just relying on sight. Make it come alive by bringing in smell and touch.
Exactly. So you minimize sight, and you bring in taste and touch or smell or, hearing. So I did a book called Creepers, and it's 8 hours in an abandoned hotel, and most of it takes place in the dark. And I just love the idea that I would write almost an entire. They have flashlights, but essentially it's in the dark. I mean, what a joy, where one thinks of now I'll be a professor, A Passage to India, E.M. Forster. The biggest scene is in a dark cave,
Right.
And also very metaphoric. In the abyss of the vast darkness of the cave, the character has this terrible realization about what life was. So but it's easy to talk about. It's difficult to do unless you're very aware that you must do it, unless you insist to yourself that it won't be just in your head, because somebody might hear a sound in their head of what's happening in the story, but it's not dramatized.
It's taking an extra step, I think, because people's first instinct is always, what does the character look like? What's the place look like? What's the room look like? The sunset, the weather, and whatnot. But this is really taking it a step further to, how do I bring this alive for the reader?
And when you walk into a room, I tend to structure my scenes so that if somebody goes in another room, it's a new, somebody goes in another room, I tend to break and have a new section there. And when you enter a room, one of the first things you notice is the smell. Every room has a smell. Right. Every room has a sound to it. And if you can attune yourself to this, and in effect, it makes us more aware in daily life, because you can't do this unless you do it as you're going through entering a room yourself, then that becomes automatic. And so, not only does your prose get better, but you become more alert and more aware by paying attention to this.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process, if you don't mind. You've written how many published books now? 30, 40? It's getting up there, 30, I know.
Maybe 30, but I have to say, one person very thoughtlessly said, "Oh, so you cranked out 30 books." Well, this is my 49th year.
Yeah.
So that's not a book a year. And this is what I do. Every day I start usually about 8:30, which is part of the process for me. And I try to write. Various books are different and short stories are different. But if everything's going well, I do 5 pages a day, and those are readable pages. Those are not thrown away, it'll do. Those are as hard as I can do it.
Writing may be the only profession where people are criticized for working hard, right? For doing too much.
It's very frustrating. And, and I'm, and then there's no guarantee. Only a few times out of those 30 books did I have a contract. I write the book and I send it in. And because often it's difficult to describe what I'm trying to do, and I just figure I'll show you. But 30 books in almost 50 years, that's, some people would say I'm dicking around, but I'm not. I'm trying as hard as I can every day, and I often work 7 days a week. There's a story about Stephen King. Steve and I were very close for many years. If he got more successful, we didn't communicate as much. But I remember being at his home in Maine, in Bangor, wonderful Victorian house he has there, and he was telling me this joke about how he wrote every day except Christmas and his birthday. Now, the reason it was a joke is he does write on Christmas and his birthday, but he figured no one would believe him if he's, if you were, obviously, if you're not Christian, that date isn't going to be important, but there are other dates that would be as important. And I just thought, I was there. He and I were, for a couple of days, wrote in the same room together. And he's much faster than I am. I'm a taker-outer, and he's a putter-inner, to quote F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he would do 5 pages, and then after dinner, come to another manuscript and revise 4 pages of those. And I saw him do it. He had these drawers full of these manuscripts. I mean, if you do 5 pages a day for 365 days a year, you're going to have an awful lot of pages. And it's from one point of view inspiring. That kind of example, it isn't always possible. Some days we get, we're not as efficient,
Right. I'm sure one of the big controversies in the writing world right now is between pantsers and planners. Pantsers, so called because they write from the seat of their pants.
Mm-hmm.
Planners because they outline. Which are you?
Oh, I'm definitely a planner. And I get some of this from John Barth, but it just makes sense to me that how can I write a book if I don't know what I'm trying to accomplish? And also another influence when I was teaching, Henry James was a big influence on. He too always knew what he wanted to accomplish. So the way I work is when an idea comes to me, I write a letter to myself in which, and I mean, it's not just any old idea, something that comes back to me a couple of days in a row or for a couple of weeks, that this is an idea that fascinates me. And so I say, all right. And I write this letter in which I ask myself why I'm interested in the idea. And it's not easy. I do a kind of schizoid thing. And good morning, David, how are you? And I say, oh, I'm fine. And how are you? Really? And then he says, and the other part of me says, well, what's this idea you have? And then I write the idea. And then the other part of me says, yeah, okay, so what? And then I try to answer that question. And sometimes these letters go on for 20 or 30 single-spaced pages. And as I analyze, and it has to be something that's important to me. The example I like to give is I did a book called Double Image, which is about photography. And the reason I became interested in photography and writing a book about it is that I was haunted by some photos I had seen in Architectural Digest about a house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's son that is in the Hollywood Hills and was owned at the time by a silent movie star named Ramon Navarro. And there he was in all his glory in this house, which Diane Keaton many years later owned. And it's a gorgeous house, but I'm looking at it and there are no shrubs or anything in the background. I mean, that's a desert locale, and it was desert back then when the house was built. And now I'm thinking there's trees. I went to visit the house. Didn't get in it, but I drove around it, and it's so lush. There were all these shrubs and everything around it. And I gradually came to understand that I associated photography with death. That if you think about it, photographs freeze time. And whenever we look at a photo, what we say is, oh, look how Uncle Joe looked back then. Look at how young he looks. Or, look, we planted that tree that year and look at how tall it is now. So the photographs measured or stopped time and allowed us then to measure by comparison the passage of time. And I thought, this is a subject worth writing a novel about. And so I then did my customary research into the world of photography to learn what I was writing about. And it's in terms of theme, it was one of my big, really one of the most enjoyable books I wrote. And just to anticipate a few things, maybe when I write a book, I ask myself, theme has to be important to me enough that it's going to spend a year of my life. Then, the old bromide, you write what you know about. Well, I don't write what I know about. I write what I want to learn about. So then I spend, the research has to be important to me. And then, as I mentioned with Creepers, there has to be something about the book itself, something about the writing of the book that will be different and interesting and that will keep my attention. And all of this I discuss in that letter to myself.
So is the letter the outline, or are they two different things?
Yes, I don't write outlines, but it's sort of an alternative. It's more exciting. it's more interesting. And in it, so then at a certain point, I say to myself, well, what kind of story would best exemplify this theme?
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm starting to talk about plotting a bit, or what kind of character. In the case of Double Image, it had to be a photographer. So then I thought, what kind of photographer? And you make these skips in our, call it inspiration or what have you. I said he's a war photographer, and he was in a hellacious circumstance where he saw so much atrocity that he photographed that he wants nothing more to do with it, and he's going to be an artistic photographer now. And the plot will be where a part of his life from the war will come at him as he's trying to go straight, as it were.
So did you have that terrific character when you started? I mean, I
No.
tend to outline as well, but the outline is mostly plot. It's just so when I sit down in the morning, I don't spend an hour figuring out what happens next.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm content to let the characters sort of emerge as I'm writing. Same for you?
Mhm.
Or
Yeah, more or less the same. The letter is an exploration. It's an attempt to, what are we trying to accomplish here? And I'm reminded Alan J. Lerner, when he was writing Camelot, the play for the script for Camelot,
right?
he had a note above his desk which said, "Camelot, how our dreams exceed our abilities." And that was what he was trying to communicate. So when I'm now, often, of course, we discover a story once we start writing it, but at the start, it sort of helps to know what I hope to accomplish. And I had books where that changed, where I was in the middle and I thought it was about one, it was another, but that's the running light.
I've had that too. Have you had, I mean, you've written for, as you were saying, almost 50 years now. Have there been some aha moments when you sort of, or penny drop moments if you prefer, when you suddenly realize something and it improved your writing ever since? I mean, a real takeaway moment?
Well, every book is different. Of late, my technique has changed. It's a little frustrating. When I wrote, as you mentioned, 3 Victorian books, mystery thrillers of the Wilkie Collins sort. Well, let's say, and those are extremely Victorian novels are complicated. So going into it, I knew that the story had to have lots of twists and more subplots than I was used to. And as the series, I wrote 3 of them, and as they progressed, my previous method have been pretty much chronological, so that I'd start here and I sort of knew where I was going. And when I begin each scene, I say, all right, how does this fit into the chronology and what am I trying to accomplish? If you go into a scene not knowing what you want to accomplish, it's going to make it work for you. But what I began to find with the Victorian books is that I would write scenes that I knew I needed, and I thought I knew where they fit, and they didn't fit. And then I'd write another one and they didn't fit. And I thought, well, it's gone now. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. And, I'm a fan of jigsaw puzzles. We always have a jigsaw puzzle going. And I began to think of this stage in my writing as being the jigsaw puzzle phase, where I have all these scenes. This is nuts. All these scenes that I'd written, and I didn't know where they fitted. And that part of the novel became how I would arrange these. I mean, I don't recommend this for anybody to do. It's maddening. But, we change, and so we should change. That's the whole point, that as writers, we should be different every day, although that's hard to do when you're writing a book, but we should certainly be different at the end of each book. It's, so I'm learning, it's like I've entered a whole new phase. I'm in the jigsaw phase of plotting my books.
So I'm going to ask you a controversial question now. I'm going to take you back to Rambo. which I bet you've also answered a few questions about. So you wrote this terrific first novel, which, spoiler alert, I won't spoil too much, but suffice to say, the book does not end the same way the film
No,
does.
it does not.
And yet, you came back and wrote, was it one or more than at least two novelizations
Yeah.
of the subsequent movies? What
Yeah.
inspired you to do that?
Well, it's a fun topic. First of all, the producers, the company that made the first three movies was called Carolco. And they were, Andrew Vanya and Mario Casar were the two fellas that ran that. I knew Andy better than I knew Mario. But in the day, 1985, 02, you couldn't get VHS. You could, but you'd pay $100 for a VHS tape to rewatch the movie.
I remember.
So that what producers did and what publishers like to do was publish novelizations, which were basically the movie in a book form. So people could read the book and remember the movie. And it was, in the 80s, it was a very hot subgenre. Well, I don't know if it's a genre, but a type. Now, here's the thing. I am, by contract, I'm the only writer who can write about Rambo in book form.
In a book.
In a book.
Yes. Okay.
And they really, really wanted novelizations in bookstores to promote the films, and also publicity to reviewers and things like that. So I said I didn't want to do it because it's a derivative format, and the is that with novelizations, you're given the shooting script and you have to reproduce it exactly, except you can describe some things and you can interiorize, you can describe what people are feeling and thinking. But usually the contract for a novelization, there are exceptions, but usually it's don't meddle with the story. It must be this way. And you're a hired hand. Mm-hmm. So this wasn't acceptable to me. And I declined. Plus, they were offering me 15 cents on the dollar. And that was not of interest to me. Normally, you get just, a fee.
Right.
And I mention this because people are writers here, and you have to think economically as well as artistically. And I said, no, until finally I got 85 cents on the dollar and the production company got 15. We got it reversed. But more than that, right? Because I could still have turned it down. I mean, the money was good, but really, there are other matters here. And they showed me the script for Rambo 2. And it was 85 pages. And how the hell you're going to get a novel out of 85 pages? I don't know.
Wow.
And it was...
Especially if you can't invent new scenes.
Yeah, right. And it was Rambo jumps up and... Serious, this was the script. Rambo jumps up and shoots this guy. Rambo jumps up and shoots that guy. That's a quote. So I said... Andy and I were talking. He'd call and he said, I really want to do this. I said, and I don't want anything to do with this. He said, well, you don't have to do it like other novelizations. We need it. You're a novelist. You created the character. So amplify the story. Okay. And I said, but, I still, is there anything else? Were there other drafts? Was there something else I can? And he said, no. Oh, yeah, there was the script. Really? There was a James Cameron. And this is before James Cameron was James Cameron.
Like
and
right
I
after
said,
Piranha
really?
2 or something.
Yeah, something like that. And I said, so can I see the script? Oh, sure, we'll send it to you. So I get the script, and it starts with Troutman getting out of a government vehicle and going into a mental institution. And there are these people seriously basket weaving and watching soap operas with glazed expression on their faces. And Troutman walks along that corridor. He goes downstairs. Now he's in the dungeon. And he walks along the dungeon, and there's way at the end, there's this iron door with steel. It's so great, with steel bars in it, and a guy with an assault rifle standing outside. And it's dark beyond the guard says to Troutman, he broke the bulb again. He thinks he's the effing Prince of Darkness. Oh, baby. Oh, baby. So I said, all right, Andy, this is what I'm going to propose to you. I'm going to write it. I'm going to write all this, but I'm going to collate the scripts. So that Cameron, because Rambo had a sidekick in the Cameron thing, probably going to be John Travolta, because Sly had directed John Travolta in the sequel to Saturday Night Fever called Stand Alive. It was so obvious it was Travolta when you saw it. And it was a comedic part, clearly not going to be in the movie. But the idea was the same plot. So I said, I'm going to collate it together. I'll get rid of the sidekick. And then, there's a lot of things here that, for example, the script says this is Rambo's going back to the prisoner of war camp from which he escaped. And this is just dropped there. And it's never mentioned again. Like Rambo, even Rambo is going to say, I don't want to go back there. He's going to have emotions about returning to where he had his nervous breakdown. So I just said, look, I can do this, but this is going to be a novelization unlike any ever written. This is going to be 1/3 shooting script, 1/3 James Cameron, me. And it was great fun to write. And the only reason I did it was because I had a chance to reinvent the novelization format. They should like it. And I did the same thing in Rambo. Script for Rambo 3 was brilliant. But for various reasons, largely budgetary, they cut and cut and cut and cut. Still, it was a pretty simple story. Beautifully produced, but simple. But oh my, the first one was Rambo of Arabia. And so what I said to Andy was, I'm going to use the first script. I'm not going to use the shooting script. And what's more, I have a lot to add because you're missing something. Afghanistan was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And the effects on the USSR were pretty comparable to what happened in America because of Vietnam. So I'm going to explore that avenue, and I'm going to have a Russian counterpart to Rambo who feels about Afghanistan in the same way that Rambo felt negatively about his experience in Vietnam. So, these are good books. These are really, really interesting, and they explore. And what's more, in Rambo 3, in Rambo 2, I made him part Buddhist. And in Rambo 3, I made him part Muslim. So that he had 4 religions. He had and this is not in my novels. The movies made him be part Native American. So I thought, all right, I can live with that. It's not in my novel, but so he's got a Native American mother, so he knows her religion. His father was Roman Catholic Italian. When he was in Vietnam, he became a Buddhist, and when he was in Afghanistan, Muslim. This is really cool stuff. not your everyday Rambo, right? I just love
this. Maybe the War and Peace of novelization. I think.
I'm gonna check this out.
In a certain length, you couldn't go on and on. But I'm very proud of them. They're very inventive.
David, this has been. I have to ring the curtain down now, but this has been a great pleasure talking to you. Hey,
I will draw the hook.
Will you come back again for some future podcast?
Oh, sure. This was interesting. It was fun to do, and I have a feeling that maybe some of what I said it will be helpful, being honest to oneself and writing what we want to write, not what, because the other thing is don't chase the market. You'll always see its backside. and also approaching this as a personal statement and not as some, the joy with I described these problems is communicated, and that's what I think writers should have. Holy hell, this is going to be cool. And when we went in on that basis. So yeah, good to see you and good to meet Jesse.
Good to see you too. We got to get you out to WriterCon sometime.
All
right, everybody, that's going to wrap it up. And thanks to everybody who joined us for this first ever live stream and video version of the podcast. Just reminding everybody, tell your friends, like this, give it reviews online. If you want to watch the video version, that'll be on my website, williambernhardt.com, and on YouTube, and maybe some other places as well. And the podcast will show up in the usual podcast places. And until next time, keep writing. And remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit.